Um, just to kind of shore up what I said before about ownership, this quote is useful. He says, ownership of the body ought to imply a radical duty to respect what the body is it should say its given nature, its intrinsic meaning, a duty that is radical precisely because here there is no more fundamental property than this. Sorry about those typos. There is no more fundamental property than this, right? And so, this idea of the ownership of the body is somewhat restrictive. But remember his view of positive freedom. Positive freedom is becoming what you were destined to become in this larger, cosmic view of creation, right? So from this perspective, you own your body when you really own it, as in own up to it. So he brings in the Hegelian notion of property here to kind of like shore up again his concept of it and to elaborate it more. He says Hegel's description implies that property represents a certain enrichment of the thing owned. Prior to ownership, a thing is an object in the world with a nature ordered to its immediate ends, but lacking a deeper spiritual purpose, until it is incorporated into a human existence and thereby elevated to a higher order of reality. So there you see, again, that progression that comes with cultivation, which is not a word he uses, but the Morin Academy talks about cult, culture, and cultivation. That comes from something Peter Morin wrote as a part of the Catholic worker movement, right? Cult, culture, and cultivation. Well, here he's talking about cultivation towards that higher order of reality, right? Of cult in the final analysis. His particular understanding of God and the church's role in the world. Okay. But notice how the thing exists in the world prior to that interaction. And then it becomes even more real, you might say, by acquiring that deeper purpose that comes when it is incorporated into a human existence. That's a very rich understanding of cultivation. A couple of other things he says I wanted to note. On page 154, he contrasts his view of property with the Lockean view. He says, to put the contrast with Locke as clearly as possible, for both thinkers, property represents a kind of expansion of the self, but whereas for Locke, the expansion occurs by way of the person taking something out of the world, out of the public order, and enclosing it within the essentially private sphere of the self. For Hegel and the pre-modern tradition he is endeavoring to retrieve, the movement is exactly the opposite one. Property represents the private person's entry, so to speak, into the public reality of the world. Rather than being essentially a privatizing of the public, property is most basically a kind of publicizing of the private, even as it includes taking in a reality into the existence of the self. Through the acquisition of property, the person realizes himself and manifests his otherwise merely inward being, making himself available in a new way to others and a significant agent in the common life of the whole. Well, you can see there why it is that the Catholic view of property is that we can't do away with it, that we can't completely communize or eliminate private property, because it is the opportunity to realize, to manifest oneself in the world. And it's interesting that he brings in Hegel here. I'm sure that this notion of, Hegel's view of property is disputable. I'm not in the business of being a Hegel like disputer of any kind, but, I take it as at least Schindler's notion of property as he tries to incorporate the Hegelian notion into his Catholic political theology. Also, I wanted to read this because it further backs up this point. He says, from the perspective just described, to say that the body is property in the most basic sense is not to say that the body is one piece of the world that has been seized, to be held until death, removed henceforth from the world, enclosed in an absolute privacy and right to exclusion, to be made use of freely by the owner alone. Instead, it is to identify the body as the place wherein the person enters the world, becomes a public persona, present to and with others, and indeed even to himself. It is the reality of the person in the strict sense of the term. The body is to me my own rather than someone else's, but at the very same time, it is that whereby I belong to the world as a real member, and etc. So I hope this helps us to understand this different view of property from the Lockean view. It comes with obligation. It comes with the challenge to understand that property, to know it, whether it's our bodies or whether it's the home in which we live, whether it's the land on which we live. We are supposed to know it and in that way own it. So it's an incarnational view of property, right, is basically what we're talking about here. The analogy is to Christ himself, who literally incarnates in the world, right? And then through the Eucharist, continues to extend himself into the world, becoming a part of the world, and through his interaction with the world, raising it up, making it better, making it a part of himself. So this is what Christ did with ultimately what's God's property, right? And so, of course, it stands to reason that we also should act like him. He is the representation of God, right? And so the goal is to do the same. And that means taking the thing up into our own higher level purpose, which is ultimately guided by, the religion, guided by revelation. All right. So having said all this, I will make mention of some of the thoughts that I have regarding these sections. Schindler's examples, as I've pointed out, most often have to do with marriage and sexual identity. He starts there. I mean, I would say that I suppose part of the reason for that is because if you understand what can take place at the most fundamental level of property and how that should work, that maybe by extension, you could then see what would happen with other stages of property, such as land and buildings and so forth, right? Or even intellectual property. But his examples, at least so far as I've encountered in the book, don't go into any other zone very far, right? You can kind of see that Schindler would be maybe a distributist if you kind of insisted on him giving you an answer. But what I see is a reasoning that could be very easily applied to abstract corporate property and the environmental harm also, like just our attitude towards our environment generally and what we should do with it in our own spheres in which we control it at the very least. Obviously, corporate property is abstract and based entirely on contract and legal abstractions. And most of the people who own corporate property and shares don't have any idea where the property lies, what it really is, what is done with it, and so on and so forth. It's literally, numbers on a screen. It has no reality. So obviously, I don't even need to there's very little reasoning that has to take place other than what Schindler has already done to end up with that critique of corporate property, which at the very least would insist on basically distributism, breaking up corporate property and particularly monopolies and redistributing property to people and groups that would actually own and take care of it. That's what it would imply at the very least. And as far as the environment goes, the very concept of you have to understand the nature of this thing, and then you have to cultivate it. You have to make sure that it flourishes and incorporate it into your very being, and it informed by a higher reality to allow it to flourish and be healthy. Well, of course, that goes along with Schindler's reasoning. So he doesn't spend any time on these things, at least yet that I can see, but we certainly can. And I think it's a very helpful line of reasoning for going into that territory. These are things, the corporate property and the environmental harm that comes from this way of dealing with property is literally threatening existential harm. So there's really no reason not to do that, and every reason to extend this reasoning into those areas. If we were to encounter the argument that, well, we have to fix, marriage and sexual identity first before we can do those things, I would disagree with that. I don't think so. And I don't think that he would necessarily make that argument. I'm just trying to imagine what you would have to do to basically explain why these individual level things need to be addressed first. And I don't know if I could make that. I could try to make that linkage. I'm not sure I want to, but I could try. It'd be kind of interesting to see somebody do that. I'm not sure I want to. He says violence is the violation of the intrinsic meaning of things or their essential nature. Well, certainly, for instance, corporate farms, right? Or massive family-owned farms that are basically run in a corporate way. Like polluting factories that dump like chemicals into rivers and kill everything in them. Runoff from farms that creates a dead zone. These are forms of violence. They are violations of the intrinsic meanings of things and their essential nature. He says the sense of property is most perfectly captured by what lies quite literally closest to the life of the body, namely land, the household, the structure in which the person lives, moves, and has his being. Property is the holding of real things. So this statement, again, just lends itself to the idea, at the very least, of distributism, and really is implicitly a critique of corporate ownership, even if he doesn't go into a great deal of that. And that brings me to the last point, which is, I think, one that Schindler helps us to remember, an somewhat archaic notion of the verb to own. He says the English verb to own has two basic meanings. On the one hand, it means to take into one's possession or to make one's own. And on the other hand, to confess or to acknowledge the truth of something. When somebody says they will own you, it means that they will not take you into their possession and use you as a commodity, but rather that they are willing to own up to their relationship with you. To own something is to say, I am responsible, that I acknowledge, and I am responsible for what I have and what I've done. Okay. And so in the case of this type of ownership of body, of dwelling, of land, or whatever it is to confess, to acknowledge the truth of the thing, right? To say, I understand the nature of this, and I have responsibilities towards it to preserve it and to make it better. So Schindler's way of reasoning has a lot of potential, even beyond what Schindler himself has attempted here. At least, like I have to say again, so far in this book, I'm through part 2 now. I literally talk about these things as I read them, so that I give a fresh reaction to them. So maybe he does, but even if he doesn't, it's extremely valuable for extending. And so next time I'm not quite out of part 3 here. There's one more chapter 6, that's For Freedom Set Free, Recovering Genuine Religious Liberty. I'll probably spend some time on that before moving into part 3, which is A Truly Catholic Politics.